We need to press a bit longer. A test.
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very good morning to everyone present here today. And a very good morning to our very, very important guest, Dr. Iza Hussin. And a very good morning. And a very good morning to Sir Safwan, Mr. Safwan, who's here also. Ladies and gentlemen, how's everyone doing? I hope you're great, having a good morning. Thank you. So welcome to the UNIRAZAK Insightful series talk. We've had a lot of exemplary leaders attending this talk to talk about their success in their lives and how they have achieved so much. We've had great leaders like Tan Sri Rafida Aziz, and today we have the honor and the privilege of having Dr. Iza Hussin here with us. Hi, Dr. Iza, how are you doing?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me, and thank you to UNIRAZAK for the opportunity to meet with students and staff.
All right, it's so great to have you. It's such an honor, when I heard the news that I'm going to be the moderator for today's event, I was jumping, I was excited, but I didn't have much time to prepare because, I was told actually it was a very last minute thing, but I did my best. I prepared as much as I can. So if I make any mistakes, please don't hate me for it. Apologize in advance. And a little bit of introduction of who Dr. Iza is. Such an exemplary person, an individual, a figure that we all should look up to as students. She is someone has done a lot. She's a very, very successful role model to all of us. So a little bit about who Dr. Iza Hussin is. I'll briefly introduce who Dr. Iza Hussin is today. Dr. Iza Hussin hails from the Venerable Cambridge University and is an associate professor in the Department of Politics, International Studies, and the World History faculty at the University of Cambridge, and a Mohammad Noah Fellow in Asian Politics at Pembroke College, Cambridge. Her research and publishing focuses on Islamic law and legal institutions in the political context of colonialism and nation building, and on global circulations of ideas about Islam and law. She is also the author of a critically acclaimed book titled The Politics of Islamic Law, Local Elites, Colonial Authority, and the Making of the Muslim State. She has also courageously written on the case of Lina Joy. If some of you know the case of Lina Joy, it was a very, very controversial case at that time. But Dr. Iza had the courage to actually write that book. That shows her exemplary characteristics to take on difficult and challenging cases. And she's written a lot about it. It was a very controversial and a highly debated issue at that time. And she also holds a bachelor's and master's degrees from the Harvard University, the Ivy League of the United States. It's such a great institution. And a PhD in political science from the University of Washington. She is also the member of the editorial board of the Social Science Research Council's Eminent Frame, a general editor of the Cambridge University Press series, Asian Connections, associate editor of Modern Asian Studies, and associate research fellow at the Joint Research Center for History and Economics. Dr. Hussin supervises students in comparative politics, religion and politics, law and society, colonial and post-colonial politics, and history. All right, that's such mesmerizing, credentials to read from someone. And you have achieved great success when it takes few minutes to read someone's credentials. Mine probably only takes about 30 seconds. All right, so Dr. Iza, it is so great to have you here. Thank you so much. And maybe you can start. We shall start with the secrets to achieving academic success, challenges, and opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands for Dr. Iza Hussin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew, for that. I hear the introductions and I don't know who that person is, but she seems quite interesting. So I was asked to come and speak to students about my own experiences, as well as to give you some thoughts about how you might navigate your own pathways. And so a little bit about what I do and why I do it. So I teach, I'm an academic, right? I teach and I do research and I write books and articles. But most of the time that I spend at Cambridge is with students. And fundamentally, my job is to make sure that there are no secrets, right? There are, to make as clear and as legible and as transparent as possible how you get from point A, which is where you stand, to point B, which is where you decide you want to go. So the first lesson, I think, is to notice that nobody has that roadmap, right? It's not a secret. It's not a mystery. It is a pathway that we make for ourselves based on our current conditions. And your conditions are different than mine were. I want to first acknowledge that the world in which we live, the world that students are navigating now, is more complicated and sometimes a little bit more difficult and more anxiety provoking than it was 15 or 20 years ago. And that your professors and your parents and your grandparents don't know what you know, right? So maybe the secrets are your secrets and you just have to teach us. Right? So that's the first thing, that the world is changing, and any advice you get from older or even old people has to be tempered with what you now know about conditions of the classroom, conditions of the world, and what you decide is important to achieve. So I had 3 stories to tell you about different stages of academic achievement as I've experienced them and as I'm now experiencing students facing them. And so the very first is a stage you have already passed, which is admissions into a university of your choice, right? At Cambridge, fellows and lecturers interview students for admission. We interview thousands and thousands of students for tens and tens of places. It's a very competitive place. And some students have been preparing for Cambridge since they were 5. You know, they've been studying, as many of you have, right? They've been studying, they've been working, they've been building CVs, they've been doing extracurricular activities, they've been doing community service, and they've been taking exams from 6 to 18 with one goal in mind. And so you can imagine that when they come in for 45 minutes of interviews, they are nervous wrecks already, right? And so our job at that point is to try and figure out, when we see an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old who has never been to Cambridge, who doesn't know anything about what it's like to be a student at a university, but who wants this and has been preparing for it all their lives, we have to make a decision not to decide whether they're the most brilliant person we've ever met or the most academically successful. We have to make decisions based on 3 things. And the first of which is, are they interested and interesting, right? So if they're engineers or musicians or theologians or people who are interested in law or politics, we ask questions that are meant to have them tell us what they're interested in, why it's important, and how they're thinking about things. And so we're really, unfortunately, by that time, fundamentally not interested in preparation from years 5 to 18, right? We're interested in what you can do in a conversation with somebody who's interested in what you have to say about the thing that you care about. So, you know, what have you been reading? What do you think about a particular problem in the world? How would you solve problems that you've never seen before? So maybe one of the first things about thinking about success is that often the people who are trying to um, test you or admit you or evaluate you are less interested in the credentials in the file that is in front of them than in the kind of problem solver you might end up being, right? And the second thing we look for is somebody who might benefit from the kind of experience that we offer. So Cambridge is a very specific place, but all universities are specific places. I mean, you know what it takes to be a successful UNIRAZAK student or a successful student at or I've just recently been in Indonesia, so the University of Yogyakarta or Gajah Mada, for example, that each of these places has different criteria for how to succeed and different pathways for doing it. And at Cambridge, we do teaching in very small groups. We do teaching in very short terms. So it's an 8-week teaching term. We have 3 of those every year. And so we're looking for people who benefit from and enjoy short bursts of high intensity academic work, who thrive a little bit under pressure, and who really like being given problems and then being told, you have 4 weeks, go solve them, however you want, right? And so that's the other thing. We're not admitting the most brilliant or the most accomplished people, even though some of them are brilliant and accomplished, but we're also looking for people who will excel given the circumstances that we can provide. And the third thing, I think, is that we're looking for people who want to make a contribution to the world, right? So not everyone who does admissions interviews at Cambridge wants to look for the next Mandela or, the next, I don't know, Bill and Melinda Gates or whatever, but it's always a bonus when we realize that the young person in front of us is interested in something besides themselves, right? So if it's helping people in the community, if it's women's education, if it's thinking about small to medium enterprises, if it's thinking about national development, we want to see how your plans for yourself and for your family might make an impact in the wider world. And that matters because when people are also thinking about scholarships and funding at Cambridge, a lot of the funding comes from external donors like the Gates Foundation or the Cambridge Trust. Often one of the questions that they'll ask is, when we fund this student, what is going to be their impact in the world, right? So do they want to be teachers or lawyers or business people or poets or dancers? What is the bigger impact if we put resources into this one person, and what is their ripple effect in the community likely to be, which has a little bit to do with what you feel like your mission is or how you would figure out what that mission is. And so, when we do admissions, we're looking for those things, right? Problem solving, resilience and tenacity, kind of clues that they might enjoy the things that we're about to put them through because it's not easy already, right? And then a sense of wider impact in the world. Students go through what you're going through now. They take classes, they take exams, they write papers, they think about thesis, they do research and internships. And then for many of them, the next stage is figuring out what to do next. And so remember the students who've been studying from 5 to 18, they got into Cambridge. That is success for an 18-year-old. But then what, right? And for some of our students, having studied for that long, once they get in, there's this moment of either exhilaration and excitement or panic and desperation, right? Depends. And for some people, it's both. When you realize you've gotten what you wanted, but there's always more to do, right? And sometimes you come into the classroom and you realize, it turns out economics is not what I was expecting it to be, right? I've sat in this class for a year and I don't love it. So then you're making decisions as students about how to take the tools that are being given to you to craft a future for yourself, right? And so between year 1 and year 3 or 4 of a Cambridge education, we fully expect students to first start to learn the things that we're trying to give them, but then take those things and drive their own vehicles, right, in the direction that they choose for themselves. So you may be finding, for example, that studying European history is wonderful, but it's not answering the questions that you have. Or you've got the European and the Western history, and now you're wondering why the books that you're reading and the texts that the papers that you're writing are so focused on the Western experience. That happens to our students a lot, and it is one of the reasons why I come to Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore and Thailand as much as I can, because one of the things that Cambridge works on and recognizes that it needs to work on more is representing the globality of what is possible, right? So we're excellent at teaching 17th and 18th century European history. We're excellent at reflecting on and building on the Western experience. We are newcomers to thinking about what it means to be Malaysian. We're newcomers to thinking about what it means to be Kenyan or Bangladeshi. And we have a huge amount to learn from the world. And very often it's students from the region, from Bangladesh, from Kenya, from Uganda, from Vietnam, from Malaysia and Indonesia, who are speaking up in classes and teaching professors and other classmates about how, in fact, lessons from Malaysia and Vietnam and Venezuela teach us different things than lessons from France and Italy and the US, right? So the other part of success is making sure not to waste what you bring with you, right? That it's not a race to catch up with Cambridge. If you imagine Cambridge as a place of British excellence fueled by many centuries of exploitation and colonialism, right? It is success to bring with you your experiences from Alostar and Penang and Kuala Pilar and Muar, and say this lecture on development has missed something really fundamental, right? This discussion about international security could benefit from experiences that we've had in the South China Sea or in South Asia. So the next part is really about having the confidence, having absorbed the lessons that places like Cambridge or Harvard or whatever have to offer, and remembering that your contribution is important, and that the knowledge that you have is neither secondary nor developing. It is already here, right? It's just a question of being in the places where people can hear it and communicating in ways that people can understand. That's the last bit, right? So students are, as undergraduates, are synthesizing information, they're reading, they're writing, and towards the end of their time, they are gaining the confidence to be creators of knowledge rather than absorbers of information, which is when you start thinking about graduate schools, for example, right? And that's what we want, is for students to become colleagues and scholars and fellow writers and teachers. And at that point, we generally do expect that people will be able to say, I've learned what I have learned. I have methodology skills. I have language skills. I have experience. I've demonstrated that I can do this work. Now give me the opportunity to go and figure out something original based on these things. And so by the time you get to a PhD or a master's, what we're asking is for an original problem, an original question. And for a lot of students from Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore, a lot of that opportunity comes not just from academic excellence, but from the ability to source funding, So that was true for me, and it's true for a lot of my students who are coming in with support from their governments or from their universities or from non-governmental organizations like the Gates Foundation or Fulbright or Chevening or Jardine Matheson or increasingly from national governments. And at that stage, you're doing two sets of things, right? You're articulating your own leadership and originality while at the same time looking for an organization to understand how what you want to do also serves a broader purpose. And so a lot of the students that I have at the master's and the graduate student level are answering deep historical questions. I have students who are working on, for example, Indian communities in brickfields and Selangor, thinking about labor relationships. I have students who are working on the involvement of Malaysian and Indonesian leaders in the non-aligned movement. I have students working on gender and sexuality in the colonial period in Perak, right? But all of those have implications for contemporary Malaysian and Indonesian and Singaporean economics, development, government, politics and policy, as well as law. And so each of these students has made a case for how the small thing that they're interested in has a bigger impact. And there are people who can help you articulate what that impact is. But one of the skills and sort of stages of success at that level is figuring out how to say, what I'm really interested in my case, is colonialism and Islam, but how to communicate that interest in ways that government bureaucrats and policymakers and NGO funders can understand. So success at all of these levels is not just about studying and working extremely hard for extremely long periods of time, which sounds both boring and uninspiring, but it's also about remembering the passion that you had at 17 or 18 and the very important questions that you had, and then figuring out new ways to communicate those to different kinds of audiences at different times, and consistently thinking, here's the thing that I want to do. How will it affect other people, right? And how can I communicate how it affects other people in ways that will be beneficial to them? So that's the process, right? I'm happy to answer questions about my own experience later if you want. I'm happy to answer specific questions about funding or admissions or challenges of being either overseas or at home as a student. But I think the other piece has to do with coping with uncertainty. So we've got students now who have been through the last years of secondary school in lockdown, right? Who missed a whole number of different kinds of milestones, who arrived in university in lockdown, some of whom took exams in lockdown. So we're living in a world none of us imagined was possible. And one of the amazing things is that it turns out it is possible, right? It's possible to do well in your exams in lockdown. It's possible to do well in school and at university in lockdown. It is possible, though not ideal, to teach classes in lockdown. So I think one of the lessons to learn from that is we all paid a really huge price, and some of us paid bigger prices than others, right? We paid a huge price in the last 5 or 6 years, and all still carry a certain amount of burden from that. But that things that didn't seem possible 5 or 6 years ago are so normal now, right? Taking classes online, figuring out how to do exams online, attending seminars in New York while sitting in KL, right? When before you had to get a visa and the US won't allow it, or you can't attend because it's very expensive. Now, increasingly, it is possible to take classes in Bangalore, and I've had classrooms with students who are in Cyprus and in London and in Jakarta all at the same time. So there are opportunities that come with the challenges. And I think the ways in which we try to be flexible hopefully have also made us all a little bit stronger and more resilient for what's about to come, because nobody thinks that the world is going back to exactly the way it was before, nor should it, right? So I think creativity and resilience and learning to pivot are important, but also asking for help, right? Being able to say to parents and colleagues and classmates and lecturers and administrators, this particular thing is not working and I can't figure it out, or I need a little bit more support. At Cambridge, we are increasingly realizing that students are needing different kinds of support at different moments in their lives, and that we all have to learn how to do things a little bit differently in order to provide that. So my own experience of all of those things involved, being the only one of my kind in any room at any point in the last 30 years, right? And that's no longer the case, right? I am not the only Malaysian, I'm not the only woman, I'm not the only Singaporean, I'm not the only Muslim. The world is becoming more diverse, and there are more and more of all of us in places that were previously entirely white and upper class, right? And I think that that's great. I think it's a sign of good things to come. It doesn't mean that life is easy at all still. But I think that that's a sign of really wonderful things in the future. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Iza Hussin. That was such a, I would say, such an enlightening speech. And as I listen about how you spoke about diversity, it somehow gives me the confidence that, I'm sure all of you here today, being Malaysians, being from diverse cultures, should take that speech very seriously, because I think at some point we doubt ourselves, how are we going to go to a university filled with white men and white women? Are we accepted? Are we going to be, mocked? Because there were racism, right? At that time, it was very challenging. But today, I realize, wow, look at the CEOs of some of the top companies in the world today. If you look at Microsoft, we look at Google, Nvidia, these are Asian people, and they are people who look like us. They are, at that time we called colored people. So, today there's great opportunities that are awaiting us. And I was so enlightened by your speech, by how you said that, we shouldn't have indicators, or if you're successful, you need this. Anyone can be successful, anyone from any communities. So that is such a great and very enlightening speech. Thank you so much. And before we proceed, later on we'll have a Q&A session, so you guys can actually have your questions prepared, and later you can ask Dr. Iza your questions. All right, so before we proceed, right, I have some interesting questions, just icebreaker questions. But this is very, very interesting questions. I was so excited to ask these questions. I prepared it a few days ago. All right. So firstly, just the icebreaker so that, they can get engagement and get to know you better personally. So number one, all right. What is your favorite food? I hope this is not going to create a controversy in the UK. Nasi lemak or eggs and sausages? Typical.
No contest, nasi lemak.
Wow, yes, nasi lemak wins. All right, number two, what is your favorite movie? King Richard by Will Smith or Inception by Leonardo DiCaprio?
So I warned Andrew that I was a nerd, and I haven't watched a movie in a decade. I've seen neither of them, so you can choose for me. What should I watch on the plane?
Yes, King Richard. Go for King Richard. It's such an enlightening and motivating movie to me. Wow. And number three, what is your favorite genre of music, jazz or pop?
I guess jazz. Sometimes it's boring, but jazz. Yeah.
And number four, they wanted to know, are you a Swiftie?
I think you can guess.
Even the Malaysian Parliament once, they
Yeah.
actually talked about this.
I think she's an amazing business person, but I do not know anything about her music. I'm sorry. What should I listen to? What's the
Should guys?
so if an alien like me shows up in the world never having heard a Taylor Swift song, I admit I haven't. What should I listen to?
Come on, guys, give some suggestions. What? All right. So, anyone have any suggestions? Enchanted.
Okay. So King Richard and Enchanted. I'll do that. Okay.
And number 5, this is my interesting one. I have a pick for me, but I'm not sure about you. Who is your favorite US president, Ronald Reagan or JFK?
No, I'm going to say Barack Obama. I refuse.
Okay.
I refuse that question.
Really? You guys agree with that? Really? Come on. You guys should listen to some of Ronald Reagan's speeches. It's super motivating, very inspirational. Personally, for me. And the last one is an open question. You can answer however you like. If you had a superpower, what would that be and why?
I have 13-year-olds, 2 of them. We have this conversation every month. This month it's going to be flight. Last month it was invisibility.
Wow, okay. I would like that too. I wish I was invisible at times, This is a really great superpower, yeah. And okay, so now we're going to open the questions to the members of the floor. You can actually ask any questions. Shall I? I'll ask the first one, okay? So you guys can proceed after me. So, Dr. Iza, I have a question, which is, I would say, actually, I have a lot in mind, but due to the time constraints, I cannot keep you longer. So the first one, I'm a very political person. I enjoy politics. I read a lot about politics. So my political question to you is, the world is changing, and it's changing drastically. And today, based on a report by Goldman Sachs last year, China is projected to have a GDP growth of 57 trillion US dollars, and India is projected to have a GDP growth of 52.5 trillion. And the US will be at third place with a 51.5 trillion US dollars. How will this change the dynamics and the power of the world order in your view?
That's a very big question. So, a lot of you are social scientists, and the way that we approach questions like that depends a little bit on our fields, right? So the people who are interested in international relations and international security will be thinking about it in terms of security dominance and military influence and diplomacy. Those of us who are interested in history and sort of comparative politics are also thinking about how places like the US and historically the UK have asserted dominance in the past, which is not through GDP, right? It's not. It is through the projection of soft power. It is through the use of networks like the UN and the EU. It is and NATO increasingly. So I think one of the challenges that China and India continue to face is what happens when economic might is not matched by cultural and political influence. Living in Southeast Asia, I think the world looks like a different place where China and India are concerned. But from the US and the UK, it's still, the US and the UK still feel like the center of the universe. And it's possible that neither state has noticed the gravitational change, whereas living in the South China Sea, you probably have. I don't know. So I don't have a full answer to that question. What I do think is that GDP doesn't have as much sway over global authority as we think, and one of the ways in which things will continue to shift is how India and China build networks in regions such as Southeast Asia, and with whom they build those networks, right? Who they choose to be local partners, how they choose to assert their authority, whether it's military or cultural, and how local businesses and elites exercise their responsibilities to their own communities in the face of that kind of power.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for answering my question. So members of the floor, you can ask your questions. Do anyone have any questions? Raise your hands and state your name. And what is your question? Thank you. Go ahead.
My question would be, what kind of experience you have experienced as a student, and what kind of challenges and opportunities have you done based on like academic wise?
So I grew up in Singapore, and until I was 19, I had always lived with my parents and in Singapore and in Australia when they were graduate students. So I went away to university. It was a 19-hour flight from Singapore. I had one box and one suitcase. I took a taxi from the airport and I showed up at Harvard Yard by myself. And then realized that I was completely and totally alone in the world, right? So I think one of the first kind of memories of that moment was realizing that some of the picture that we have of trajectory and success and studying overseas is so rosy, but some of it is also very challenging, very isolating, and requires a great deal of day-to-day navigation of normal things, right? How do you figure out how to get food at the canteen? How do you call your parents once a week? You know, we didn't have, this was before cell phones and the internet, I'm sorry to say. So there is that emotional and social part of being in a new place as a very young adult for the first time. The other is also navigating a system that for many people is familiar and that for me simply wasn't. So I took a degree called social studies, which is a kind of multidisciplinary social theory degree. And we wrote essays and submitted them, and then they got marked, and then we discussed them in class. But for some reason, it took a year for anyone to tell me that when they give you when they say, you know, write a 10-page essay on Karl Marx, right? That everybody else in the class was writing double-spaced essays, and that I was writing single-spaced essays, and nobody said anything for a year. So the first year was much harder than it needed to be because I was writing twice as much as everyone else in my class. And I realized that now, that maybe if I had spent more time talking to people and asking questions, I would have realized that, but I didn't. So one of the huge learning moments was realizing that life gets a little bit easier if you work with other people, if you talk to other people, if you are not afraid to ask questions. And Singaporeans and Malaysians are more afraid to ask questions than Americans, right? They're more afraid to say things in class. They're more worried that they sound not as smart. Americans are not worried about that, but that's in my experience in the classroom, teaching British people and French people and Malaysians and Singaporeans and Indians and Pakistanis. Every student has a contribution to make. But we come from different cultures of self-assertion and confidence and discussion. And so sometimes you go into these classrooms for the first time and everyone, well, half the people look like they're completely comfortable, they're happy to talk and they want to share their ideas. And the other half doesn't say anything. But often the other half is thinking everything that you want them to be thinking. They just won't say it, right? And so we have to, in the classroom in Cambridge, but we're often finding that it's a particular challenge to get students from some social and economic backgrounds, from some national backgrounds, to overcome their initial reluctance to share their ideas. And when they do speak, they turn out to be twice as impressive as people who've been talking the whole time. So that also is important, right? Just thinking those things through. There are gender differences in the classroom as well, right? So my PhD advisor, who was at the University of Washington, a man named Joel Migdal, who's a scholar of state and society, would tell his PhD students, who are a mixed group of men and women, that when my male PhD students come into my office, my job is to convince them that they are not yet Max Weber. And when my women PhD students come into my classroom and my office, I have to convince them that they may become Max Weber, right? That there are also sort of gendered dynamics in classrooms that mean that discussions can sometimes be dominated by men. They can sometimes be dominated by people who have greater sort of social and economic resources. And so inclusion in the classroom has often become about convincing everyone that they have a contribution to make. And that took me many, many years to figure out for myself, right? The discount factor that you apply on yourself is often the biggest one. The last is really about the very surprising lesson, which is that the friendships that you make in your undergraduate life, hopefully never go away, right? That as I got older and went into master's or PhD level, had a family, that a lot of the people that I met when I was 19 or 22 continue to be a huge part of not just my personal life, but also my professional life. And that at every stage you meet people who turn out to be incredibly significant professionally or personally, and that the world is much smaller than it seems. So the lesson for me was, one, that there can be friends in every room, right? But also never to make enemies, because they don't go away either. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Dr. Iza. Thank you, Adlina, for asking the question. And ladies and gentlemen, anyone else have a question to ask? Yeah.
Hello, Doctor. My name is Afiq. So I have a question and asking for an advice. How do you advise a person who learning in kinesthetic way? Yeah. So they are able to understand by their needs hands-on. So what can you advise them?
Thank you. It's a great question. Primary and secondary education is better at doing this than universities, right? So we still have this model in universities of people sitting in cramped chairs, taking notes in front of them, right? And then going to libraries and taking notes in front of them. So I think the first thing is recognizing that there are many different styles of learning, and that that having a style of learning and figuring out what works for you is a huge challenge, but also a big gift you can give yourself, right? So I'm not a professional in pedagogy, but from watching different students do different ways of learning, I mean, one of the things I am realizing is that perhaps laptop note-taking is even worse for people who are kinesthetic than it is for everybody else, right? But even for people who are visual learners, laptop learning can be very problematic, right? So I find that the kind of processing that happens when I write notes by hand, when I sit in a lecture and write notes by hand, or when I transcribe a recording, is very different from the kind of recall I have from typing. So often I sit in lectures and I talk to students and I all I can see is their eyebrows, right? And all I can hear is the clacking. And then 3 months later, they come in and they ask me a question, and I know that I've said it 3 times in lecture, and they know as well, but there is no recall. And I'm worried that part of that is because of the typing and the laptop and the monopoly that laptops have on our learning. So I wonder whether it would make sense to vary the mediums by which you remember and record information, right? Giving yourself permission to learn while listening and walking, right? Giving yourself permission to record voice notes into a computer or write things into a notebook, or using different colored pens or whatever, right? That I think it's a cliche, but a generation that is heavily dependent on touch screens and laptops, I think is not doing itself any favors in terms of like the whole range of ways in which the brain processes information. So maybe we all need a little bit more training in neuroscience and pedagogy, and not to assume that everybody learns in the same way.
All right, thank you, Dr. Iza. Thank you, Afik, for asking the question. We shall have one more question from any. All right, let's go.
Hello, Dr. Iza. My name is Irfan, and I have a question in which quite a bit of a range, but I do want to ask your opinion, because we know that in case of politics, everyone have their opinions. So you've been an expert on it. Sometimes you know the fallacies on people's thinking. So why do you think that people have most of this thinking, and how do we penetrate those problems? And that's my question.
So are you talking about kind of political disagreement?
It's mostly like, I think their approach on politics, because sometimes it was emotionally biased, as we all know. But how do we make an equal ground to watch it on objective viewpoint? So that's my question.
I wish I had a good answer. I'm not sure I do, but the kind of research and writing that I do has taught me that there's no such thing as an objective truth, right? That we all stand on the basis of our own experience and interests and knowledge when we articulate viewpoints, and that we all, even when we're speaking for communities, are making huge assumptions about what people want, what they need, and what they value. So to give an example, right, so Brexit's a good example. I think let's talk about something a little bit further away, but that still has immediate consequences, right? We moved, my family and I moved to the UK 6 months before the referendum, and we moved to a city full of international people, politically quite liberal, very economically and socially privileged, and Cambridge assumed that Europe was a clear positive, that association with the rest of the world was incredibly important and valuable, and we assumed that everyone in the country who was going to vote in the referendum knew what we knew, right? That's not the case, right? So the week after the referendum, you couldn't find a single person in Cambridge who could understand, we're supposed to know everything, right? Turns out we didn't know even that, right? We didn't understand that sometimes when people make decisions, political decisions on their own behalf, they don't necessarily do it out of a cost-benefit calculation, and they don't necessarily do it with all of the information available. They do it based on a sense of um, having been dispossessed or ignored, right? So a huge part of the Brexit vote had to do with a sense in the north and in the west of the country that the educated elites in London and Cambridge and Oxford had ignored people for so long that it was time to teach them a lesson, right? So there's an emotional component of that. There's also a component of voters making decisions based on very limited information that they were getting from some as well. That sometimes people are making decisions not based on thorough sweep of the facts, but on trusted sources that turn out to have political skews of their own, right? And also a great number of people were making decisions based on emotional calculations about Europe itself, right? And the EU. And so feeling very much like national sovereignty was more beneficial than international cooperation. And so now we live in a country where, right or wrong, we no longer have access to the benefits of the European Union. And so now we have to decide, having had this profound and cataclysmic disagreement, how do we move on, right? The things that we were building are broken, and particularly in universities, it's a huge problem because it affects research funding and graduate funding and the kinds of students we get as well. So how do we move on from broken political debates? And I think one of the things that's been inspiring about post-Brexit Britain, not everything has been inspiring about post-Brexit Britain, but one of the things that has been inspiring is figuring out how people are building communities from the grassroots, right? Homeless shelters, welcoming refugees, making sure children who come from economically deprived neighborhoods and communities have food at school. So asking different kinds of questions about what holds us together and how we can serve each other. So unfortunately, it feels as though so many of our political experiments are breaking, and that people who are building the most successful reimaginations of community are doing it one family at a time, one person at a time from the ground up, which means then that you trust your neighbors, right? That you know whether or not the people next door have food, that you're watching out for people's children and schools and, intersections and cars, but really, really small community efforts that then are having important implications on who gets elected to parliament, on who gets elected in the elections coming up in June, for example, right? But whoever, the reality is once broken, it's going to take generations to rebuild, right? And so anyone who inherits post-Brexit Britain coming up is going to have to work at building again from the ground up. But I think the answer to your question is really networks of trust, which can only be built one person at a time. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Iza. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and I believe that many of us here have learned a lot from Dr. Iza's talk, and also thank you so much for answering the questions that were posed to you. And looks like we don't have much time because Dr. Iza has to fly off back to the venerable Cambridge University. So I think what we'll do right now is take a quick photo session with all of the students and also with Dr. Iza as well. Right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.